We'll start off at the quarterback with Kyler Murray. He was one of my favorite quarterbacks to draft because, well, the Cardinals have a very easy schedule, and it starts with the Saints this week. Their defense comes into the season with a lot of question marks, and Murray is a dual-threat quarterback, so I'm starting him this week in New Orleans. I also like Brock Purdy, and I get that there are some question marks about his pass catchers. Brandon Ayuk is out. Juwan Jennings is a question mark. But Purdy beat Seattle for 5 total touchdowns and over 42 combined fantasy points last season. So I'm going to stick with Brock Purdy in this NFC West matchup. The quarterbacks I'm avoiding, I'll start off with Jared Goff. And I get it. He's been a good fantasy quarterback during his time in Detroit. But historically, he has struggled in Green Bay. In 4 career games at Lambeau Field as a member of the Lions, he's averaged just 12.3 points per game. And that was before the Packers traded for Micah Parsons. So I'm going to avoid Jared Goff this week. And I'm also going to avoid Justin Fields. Now, I like him during the course of the regular season, but not this week in a revenge game against the Steelers. Their defense is one of the most talented in the league, and it's proven that it can really slow down mobile quarterbacks. Remember last year, Lamar Jackson had 68 rushing yards and no touchdowns in 2 games against them. The total in this game is also very low at 37.5, so I'm not expecting a lot of fantasy production from Fields in this contest. All right, let's move on to the running backs and Chuba Hubbard, who broke out last year. He was tied for 14th in fantasy points among running backs. He averaged over 16 points per game, and he's got a really good matchup this week against the Jaguars. Their defense was one of the worst in terms of stopping running backs last year. In fact, they gave up the second most fantasy points to the position. So even though Rico Dowdle's in the mix, I'm still starting Chuba Hubbard as an RB2. And I also like Tony Pollard, and I get it. This is not a great matchup in Denver, but this is more of a volume play. Keep in mind, Tajay Spears is out. So Pollard should see 15 plus touches in this game, and the Titans are going to want to play the time of possession game because they want to protect their young quarterback in Cam Ward. So I would start Tony Pollard as an RB2. A player that I'd be worried about this week, though, is Breece Hall. And I get it, you probably have to play him. But last season, Pittsburgh's defense allowed just 4 rushing touchdowns and the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to running backs at their home stadium. Keep that in mind. Also, Breece Hall could lose some work to Braylon Allen, maybe even Isaiah Davis. So there's a lot of question marks with Breece going into week 1. I'm also going to fade Nick Chubb. And this may seem like low-hanging fruit, but because he's going to be the starter in Houston, he's going to be flexed in a lot of fantasy leagues. Remember, Joe Mixon is out. We don't know when he's coming back, but Chubb is not the same player who was a fantasy star several years ago with the Cleveland Browns, and he could be sharing some of the workload with Dameon Pierce and maybe Woody Marks. So I would beware Nick Chubb this week. If you need him as a flex, you can start him, but I would temper my expectations. At the wide receiver position, I love Ricky Pearsall. He was one of my favorite sleepers going into the season, and I think you can flex him against Seattle. Remember, the Niners, they are a mess in terms of their pass attack. Brandon Ayuk is out. Juwan Jennings is a big question mark. So Pearsall should see a lot of targets in this offense alongside George Kittle. So until the Niners passing game really gets whole, Pearsall is a really good play from a fantasy standpoint. I'm also going with Emeka Egbuka, the rookie who has looked phenomenal during training camp in the preseason. His stock rose in terms of drafts, and I like the matchup against Atlanta. They gave up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers last year. Oh, and keep in mind, Chris Godwin's injured. Jalen McMillan is injured too. That means Egbuka could end up seeing a lot of targets in this game, so start him as a flex. A couple of wide receivers I'm worried about this week. Well, we'll start off with Calvin Ridley, and this one's obvious, guys. He's facing the Broncos and Patrick Surtain. That is not a good recipe for fantasy success. Last season, Denver allowed just 4 touchdowns to visiting perimeter receivers and only 18.2 points per game, so Ridley is a fade for me. I'm also going to fade Chris Olave. Why? Well, Chris Olave has got a big-time question mark at the quarterback position. You've got Spencer Rattler, who's going to be the starter. I'm not sure he's better or worse than Tyler Shough, but neither one of these guys excites me. And also keep in mind, last year when Olave played, he averaged fewer than 10 points per game. He was very inconsistent, so I'm going to keep Olave on the fantasy sidelines. All right, now to the tight ends, and I like David Njoku. Now, I get it. The Browns have all kinds of question marks in terms of their offense, but Joe Flacco is going to be the starter. And when Flacco and Njoku played together in 5 games in 2023, Njoku had 390 yards and 4 touchdowns. And I think the Browns are going to be playing from behind in this game, which is a good thing for the pass catchers. So start David Njoku and go with Tyler Warren. I really like the rookie. This is a guy who I have ranked at the back end of the tight end ones this week. If you watched him in the preseason when he played, he was getting a lot of looks, and he's going to stay on the field for all 3 downs. And Miami's defense, they have plenty of holes in the back 7, and they also allowed more than 13 points per game to tight ends last year. So I really like Tyler Warren as a potential number 1, not only this week, but throughout the course of the season. Tight ends that I don't love this week, well, let's start off with Dalton Kincaid, he's in a rough spot this week against the Ravens. Their defense was middle of the road against tight ends last year, but it still held Kincaid to a combined 11.8 fantasy points in their 2 matchups, including the postseason in 2024. And Kincaid's also failed to score more than 9.3 points in 8 of his 14 home games against AFC opponents. So I'm going to fade Kincaid. I'm also going to fade Colston Loveland. And listen, this is a guy who's got limitless upside. But in week 1, against a defense that's pretty tough against tight ends, in fact, they only allowed 3 touchdowns at the position last season. And I feel like Loveland is someone I want to sit and see what happens. Also, keep in mind the Bears have a lot of mouths to feed, so Loveland might not see enough targets to be a fantasy relevant tight end in week 1.